Over the last month or so, I have, much like Jesus, suffered for the sins of mankind. Week in and week out, strapping myself to a chair, taping my eyes open, burning a lifelong image of Dragon Ball GT into my retinas that no amount of bleach could ever dare remove. Okay, maybe it's a slight exaggeration, or am I being completely unfair here? Was my time spent watching Dragon Ball GT as bad as I anticipated, or many claimed? Surely not. After all, there's a substantial fan base for Dragon Ball GT online that defends the show vehemently. But which is it? It can't be the worst thing to have ever happened to Dragon Ball, that doesn't exist, while also being a show that's quite good, can it? Today I'm going to give my final verdict on a series that has more detractors than The Last Airbenders movie, while still maintaining a massive fan base that will defend it to its last days. Having now seen the entire show from beginning to end, I will be examining, exposing, and expressing my opinions on the parts that I hated and loved within the crazy, confusing, and captivating grand tour that would ultimately become Toei Animation's final outing with the Dragon Ball property for many, many years to come. This is my final and complete review for Dragon Ball GT. In an effort to be fair here in my final review of the show as a whole, I will be looking at and praising the parts I thought worked and criticizing the aspects I thought didn't work, using these as the basis for my final personal verdict at the end. Got it? So here's the stuff I liked. The theme song. Dragon Ball GT's theme song might be my absolute favorite opening theme for any product ever. Never mind Dragon Ball in general. I enjoyed Super's openings for the most part, and I loved Chala Head Chala as much as the next person. But GT's theme song got me pumped to go on a galactic search for some Dragon Balls. The visuals in the opening capture exactly what I wish this show felt like while watching it. Full of heart, adventure, excitement, and mystery. And after having wrapped up work the other day, something remarkable happened, and strangely enough, it involved Dragon Ball GT. I was driving my best friend and his new wife, whom he met in Japan, to the city. She doesn't speak perfect English just yet, and I'd imagine finding a way to participate in conversation is quite difficult. After a bit, the car felt quiet, and because I've been living, breathing, and sleeping Dragon Ball GT for the last month or so, I began humming its theme song. No more than 2 seconds into it, she joins in and starts singing the words along with me, which to my surprise I was able to join in on too. I mean, give me a break, I've listened to this song like a million times this month. That connection was important, and it gave us a window into talking about manga and anime for the next few hours, so in a way, without GT I wouldn't have had that. Moving on to the show proper, I appreciated and noticed right from the beginning of the second arc that despite there not being much similar in terms of tone from Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball GT did make a concerted effort to link every arc together in one way or another. This genuinely helped me think of the story as just that, one big long story rather than individual smaller segmented ones. This is something a lot of shows fail in doing, but GT did not, and it specifically helped the Baby and the Shadow Dragon sagas feel like something more. Speaking of which, the concepts for the Baby and Shadow Dragon sagas were honestly very appropriate and well chosen for Dragon Ball. The first arc of the series, to me at least, didn't feel like a fitting continuation of the story that Dragon Ball had left off on. Dragon Ball Z had focused largely on magic and sci-fi elements, and to suddenly switch to exclusively adventure targeted towards children felt out of place, which is why when Baby turned up, returning Dragon Ball to a sci-fi atmosphere, it felt very much like a return to form for me. And it most certainly was. The writing for the first 80% of the arc was very tight, with a ton of well-executed surprises and character-driven moments through Goten, Mr. Satan, Majin Buu, and even Oob. Additionally, the Shadow Dragon saga, as a concept at least, is probably the most fitting final arc I've ever seen attempted for a show like Dragon Ball that really was never conceived with an ending in mind. Also, I really enjoyed the motivation Pan had to involve herself in the story at the beginning. I found her desire to prove herself to be compelling and offered a lot in the way of opportunity for big moments in the future. So, as an isolated decision to start her character off as that, I thought it was a very well orchestrated beginning. Additionally, the inclusion of a sentient Dragon Ball radar in Giru or Gil was something I was very apprehensive of at the beginning. I thought it could have very easily become a gimmick and annoying, but thankfully I was wrong, and he ended up being the biggest hero in the series for me. In the looks and aesthetics department, I thought GT was rather consistent. At no point that I noticed did the quality dip below what we would have come to expect from Dragon Ball Z. Additionally, once again from the conceptual department, Super Saiyan 4's design I thought was quite interesting at the very least. It fit in perfectly with the Baby saga, and it wasn't another blonde variation of Super Saiyan, but its own unique thing that has garnered its own strong following online. And in my experience, this transformation's design seems to be the most memorable attribute from Dragon Ball GT as a whole. And finally, of course, I absolutely adored the final episode with all my heart. The reason I've taken the time to point out all of what I've enjoyed about the series is to help those that really did enjoy this show to understand that anything I disliked is coming from a place of me wanting to enjoy the show. We all like and dislike different things, and I'm about to explain to you guys everything I disliked about this series. So, let's dive in. Things I didn't like. I go into excruciating detail as to what I specifically dislike about Dragon Ball GT's first ever arc in this video here, but in short, it felt like it didn't know what it wanted to be. Tonally, it felt all over the place, and in terms of pacing, it felt like it was really dragging its feet. Kozo Morishita, a producer who worked on Dragon Ball GT's description of this part of the show feels turbulent to say the least. The team seem filled with uncertainty surrounding the direction of the show, which is why they take a hard turn into something familiar with the Baby Saga almost immediately after the first arc. It's as if the show's beginning was geared exclusively towards children instead of a mixed demographic like its predecessor was. Super Saiyan 4, despite being a massive fan favorite moment in the show, one even I acknowledged earlier in this video, doesn't feel earned at all to me and ends up being practically the only form Goku uses from that point onward, resulting in us seeing Goku need to go Super Saiyan 4 in order to lift something over his head or to save a town, which honestly to me seems excessive when you consider turning Super Saiyan 3 made the earth shake. In other words, despite specific power numbers not mattering in a show like Dragon Ball, an understanding of how strong someone actually is relative to another character in the show is very important. The peak of my GT confusion, however, came about during the fight with Shenron at the end. In base form, Goku is pushing his blast back. Like, what? And furthermore, how he gets his tail back is fun and funny, and I've mentioned that in the video prior, but it flies in the face of every form that came before it. Great design or not, the form has no journey, and I genuinely don't care much for it because of that. In other words, I'd personally still like regular old Super Saiyan if it didn't look as cool as it does, simply because of what it represents in the story. And for Super Saiyan 4, I only care about it because it looks cool. To show that I'm being completely fair here, I equally don't care at all about Super Saiyan 3. It comes out of nowhere in the story with no build-up and doesn't feel earned. And therefore, much like Super Saiyan 4, I don't really care about it because it doesn't carry any emotional significance. On the action side of things, I thought the action and fights are honestly quite forgettable. I'm able to watch them in the moment, but they are, for the vast majority of the time, generic fight sequences that, unlike the main series, really are hurt by the absence of an Akira Toriyama source manga. And while we're on the topic of boring and generic, Super Android 17's arc made absolutely no sense to me. How did Dr. Gero and Dr. Mew build another android in hell? What parts do they use? How do they communicate with Android 17 in the living world without telepathy or the aid of someone like King Kai? These aren't small nitpicks I have. These are parts of a story that are left unexplained as if it's not important, despite the entire story hinging on these very plot points. Why could Piccolo communicate in the afterlife without the help of someone like King Kai? Someone he needed help from prior. Why can Yema move someone to hell but not out of hell? It seems ridiculously convenient. Why did anyone stay behind in hell to fight Goku in the first place? Alone, he can do just about as much as he did with Frieza and Cell there. It felt like their presence was included only to pad an already very short runtime. And finally, Android 18 and Krillin played a tiny part in the overall story, but ultimately amounted to being the most interesting part by a country mile. They should have had more to do. And to be honest, Dragon Ball GT as a whole just felt very confusing to me. And I think that confusion can be heard in these snippets from an interview Kozo Morishita participated in 2005. Although Dragon Ball GT turned Goku back into a kid, which signified returning him to square one, story-wise I thought that not going back was important. Dragon Ball GT was made so as not to drag out Dragon Ball Z, and I suppose it's also because we were too caught up in creating new enemies. I remember working extremely hard thinking of what the enemy would do and what sort of bad people they would be. Thinking back on the series now, the enemy characters of Dragon Ball GT have certain parts that are based off of enemies from Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. And speaking of confusing, Pan is literally only there to cause trouble and conflict, exclusively to provide motivation and cause for Goku and sometimes Trunks to act in a proactive manner to save her. This bothered me for two reasons. The first is obvious as it becomes quite quickly a tired character contrivance, but the second is a little more under the hood, so to speak. The first two episodes that introduce us to Pan are filled with scenes showing us that she is surrounded by people that undervalue her as a capable fighter and defender of the earth, not taken seriously and constantly treated like a little princess, which she doesn't like. That sets up, I thought quite clearly, a character arc whereby she grows to understand what it takes to be a galactic defender and for her family to see her and treat her her like the respected warrior she wants to be, much like Trunks, Vegeta, and Goku are. But no, time and time again, she is shown to be ignorant, mean, insanely childish, and completely wrong. I'm pretty sure if I was to try and count all the times Pan caused the group trouble, I'd die of old age first. And this is a particularly important criticism, I think, for one big reason. Dragon Ball GT acknowledged and put large funds into course-correcting the direction of the show after the first arc. They wanted to move away from the episodic, self-contained nature of these episodes they were working on in order to create more spontaneous and action-filled stories. And in keeping these tired formulas of Pan getting into trouble being the catalyst for action, it just feels like they changed the wallpaper but not the room. The villains are different and the setting is different, but the motivations to fight are the exact same, which despite their best efforts only ends up feeling less spontaneous as a result, ironically. On the other side of things, Trunks sort of assumes the role Bulma did in early Dragon Ball, being the one that knows how to use tech that helps the plot move forward. However, again, because we're moving from a show that had so many of its greatest parts from the change and development of a number of characters for it to then go to a series where growth isn't delivered at all, it made the show, to me at least, feel a lot less interesting. Goku already doesn't change, and to surround him with more static character arcs just makes for a much less interesting cast of characters for Goku to bounce off of. Furthermore, because the show quickly reverted to an action sci-fi show on Earth halfway through Season 2, Trunks found himself almost useless as he had to compete for screen time with the likes of Goten, Gohan, and Vegeta, all characters that have either more interesting personalities or have been established for much longer in the series. This wouldn't have been an issue had he demonstrated something unique or magnificent in the prior episodes, but he really didn't do all that much, bar one or two things. And so that's largely the reason why in the fourth arc, Vegeta sort of comes out of nowhere to join Goku in the spotlight for the battle against Shenron. Toei must have noticed that this sort of comes out of nowhere as they interrupted the fight with Goku to show an entire flashback episode for Vegeta, as he had up until this point played a minor role in the show at best. His biggest role being used as a vessel for Baby in 2 arcs prior, where realistically Baby did most of the talking. And finally, for the last ever episode of Dragon Ball GT, I have a few things to say. But before I do, here's another short snippet from that interview with Kozo Morishita. He said, "There were fans who wondered, why are you ruining the original? And also those that thought the ruined parts were what made it interesting. Perhaps Dragon Ball GT pushed away some of those who had been fans from the very beginning of the manga's run. However, I am certain that even fans who were naysayers will be convinced if they watch the final episode of Dragon Ball GT." In that very same interview, Kozo mentions that from the very beginning they had agreed on how the story for Dragon Ball GT would end. Which to me begs the question, why does it feel like it only works because of the original Dragon Ball series? Krillin, Vegeta, and Piccolo get emotional send-offs in that very episode, providing the majority of the nostalgia from it. Yet their contribution to Dragon Ball GT as a whole was next to nothing. Now don't get me wrong, the final episode works exceptionally well, but it does so in spite of Dragon Ball GT and because of Dragon Ball Z. Not because Dragon Ball GT contributed anything to it, they could have quite literally made that episode right after Dragon Ball Z and it could have had the same impact. And that says a lot about what was actually achieved in Dragon Ball GT, I think. I understood from the very moment I sat down to tackle this month-long project that, despite my best efforts, a large portion of people would undoubtedly leave having just watched this series unfulfilled and disappointed with what I had to say about it. Not necessarily because I didn't put an adequate amount of care or effort into these videos, but because their voice wasn't heard or reflected upon in my final thoughts. The very fact that that is true is proof of one thing to me, that no matter how much anyone studies writing, attempts to empathize and understand the viewpoints of others, or rewrites draft after draft of a script, a full comprehensive understanding of Dragon Ball is impossible. And I think that's what makes it so successful across almost every single culture on this planet. I can begin humming the tune of Dragon Ball GT around my best friend's new wife, and she can finish the melody from memory despite us not being able to communicate seamlessly yet. I can run into a random Colombian family on vacation and explain to them what I do for a living. They can get excited because they have fond memories of this show. The odds of everyone liking and disliking the same things about a particular piece of art are astronomical. And I think that's okay. To me, these are the reasons I personally didn't connect with Dragon Ball GT, but if you did, I totally respect and kinda love that, because to me at least, it emphasizes what is perhaps the most elusive and magical quality of Dragon Ball: its ability to bring joy in the most unlikely of ways to the most unlikely of places. So if you enjoy Dragon Ball GT, that's awesome. I hope you guys enjoyed this series, and until next time, thank you so much for watching.